Think for a moment about the world around you. The chair you're sitting in, the light you're reading by, the very structure of the days and weeks that govern your life. Our society, our laws, our technology, the entire complex and sprawling rhythm of our modern existence. It all feels so solid, so certain, doesn't it? It feels so utterly inevitable. We gaze back across the vast ocean of time, through the grand, sweeping story of history, and we instinctively assume that it could only have ever led to this precise moment. To us, we see the past as a straight line, a pre-written story with a foregone conclusion. But this assumption, this comfortable belief in the stability of our own timeline, is perhaps the greatest illusion of all. This entire reality, everything we know, every piece of culture we inherit, every idea we take for granted, was almost completely and utterly erased before it even had a chance to begin. The whole grand tapestry of Western civilization was, for one terrifying moment, balanced precariously on the sharp edge of a knife. A secret, insidious plot, a conspiracy festering like a poison in the heart of a forgotten war, a scheme known only to a handful of bitter, resentful men, came dangerously, terrifyingly close to winning. If it had not failed at the very last possible second, if one man's life, a single, beating heart, had not been tragically traded for the destiny of the entire world, the civilization you know, the world you inhabit, would simply not exist. It would be a ghost, a phantom possibility in a history that never was. In this video, we are not just telling a story. We are uncovering the conspiracy that almost rewrote history itself. We are journeying back across 2 millennia, to an age of titans and monsters, to the bloody, violent, and chaotic twilight of the Roman Republic. Our destination is the story of the one man who almost broke the back of Rome, the forgotten genius who nearly strangled the Republic in its cradle, and the shocking betrayal that, in a twist of fate, ultimately saved it. This isn't just some dusty tale from the ancient world, a curiosity for historians. This is the chilling, resonant story of the world that almost was. Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales. Today, we journey to the late Roman Republic, the 1st century BCE. It is a time that echoes with names that sound more like legends than men. Gaius Marius, the populist general who reforged the Roman legions into a political weapon and opened their ranks to the landless poor. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the ruthless, iron-willed dictator who bathed the city of Rome in the blood of his enemies and tore up the Constitution to make himself its absolute master. And of course, the 2 colossal figures who would rise from the ashes of their conflict to dominate the world stage. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, the celebrated conqueror of the East, and Gaius Julius Caesar, the man whose name would become synonymous with power itself. Their epic wars, their titanic ambitions, their world-shaking legacies. We are taught that these men and their struggles define the end of one era and the violent birth of another. We're taught that their personal rivalry was the main event, the central, unavoidable conflict that forged the Roman Empire from the dying embers of the Republic. But what if that isn't the whole story? What if the narrative we've been given, the one carefully curated by the victors, is missing its most crucial chapter? What if the greatest, most existential threat to Rome in this entire chaotic century wasn't one of these legendary, almost mythical figures? What if the most dangerous man of the age, a military and political genius whom terrified contemporaries whispered was the spiritual heir to Hannibal Barca himself, has been largely and deliberately written out of the story? There's an old, cynical saying that history is written by the victors, and the haunting story of Quintus Sertorius is perhaps the ultimate, most tragic proof of this truth. He was a brilliant statesman, a peerless general, a man of principle in a world that had abandoned them, and a rebel who, for 8 straight, bloody years, held the full, undivided might of the Roman war machine at bay. From the rugged, unforgiving wilderness of ancient Spain, he forged his own independent state, a rival Roman republic that stood as a direct challenge to the authority of the capital. He brought the official government, the one that had cast him out, to its very knees. He was so successful, so profoundly dangerous, that Rome had to break all of its own rules and send its greatest champion, the young, ambitious, and seemingly invincible Pompey the Great, not to conquer him, but just to try and contain him. But Sertorius's vision, his grand design, went far beyond a simple provincial rebellion. He was on the very verge of cementing a vast, international alliance that would have encircled and choked the Republic, attacking it simultaneously from the Wild West and the opulent East. For the Senate in Rome, it was a nightmare scenario made real, a coordinated, global war against a coalition of their most hated enemies, a conflict that could have decisively shattered Roman power forever. And it almost worked. So why isn't his name as famous as Caesar's or Pompey's? Why is this mastermind relegated to a footnote in the annals of history? Because his grand, world-altering design wasn't stopped on the battlefield by a superior general. It was brought down from within by a treacherous, backstabbing conspiracy born of the most corrosive human emotions: pure, unadulterated jealousy and craven fear. This is the case file on the Sertorian War, a forgotten conflict that hinged on one of history's most consequential and devastating assassinations. Who truly was Quintus Sertorius? What was his revolutionary, and perhaps more inclusive, vision for a different kind of Rome? And how did a single secret dinner party, a dropped cup as a signal, and a well-placed dagger change the entire course of Western civilization forever? To truly understand the man who would become Rome's most formidable and feared rebel, you first have to understand the brutal, unforgiving world that shaped and scarred him. Quintus Sertorius was born around the year 126 BCE in Nursia, a small Sabine town nestled deep within the rugged, formidable Apennine Mountains of central Italy. This simple fact of his birth defined his entire existence. He was a novice homo, a new man, in the deeply, almost pathologically class-obsessed world of the Roman Republic. This was a label that carried immense weight. It meant that his family, while respected landowners back home in Nursia, had never produced a Roman senator. They were outsiders to the closed, aristocratic circle that held a vice-like grip on all power, wealth, and influence in Rome. For a man like Sertorius, this meant he would have to fight, bleed, and claw his way up the ladder of power for every single scrap of recognition, while blue-blooded aristocrats half his age and with a fraction of his talent could glide effortlessly into positions of command. It was a reality that bred a deep-seated resentment in many, but in Sertorius, it forged an unbreakable will. His early career was a textbook, almost cinematic example of raw courage and innate military skill. He first saw action in the devastating Cimbric War, a desperate, existential fight for Rome's survival against a massive migration of Germanic and Celtic tribes who had already handed the Republic some of its most catastrophic and humiliating defeats in history. At the utterly disastrous Battle of Orazio in 105 BCE, a bloodbath where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were mercilessly cut down in a display of tactical incompetence, the young Sertorius found himself wounded and knocked from his horse amidst the slaughter. Yet he survived. In an act of pure grit and defiance, he swam across the freezing, turbulent waters of the Rhone River, weighed down by his full armor and shield, and made it to safety. This feat alone became the stuff of legend. He later served with distinction under the legendary General Gaius Marius, proving his cunning by sneaking into a fortified enemy camp disguised as a Gaulish warrior to gather critical intelligence before a major, decisive battle. He was, in every sense of the phrase, a soldier's soldier. During the Social War, a vicious and bloody internal conflict between Rome and its own Italian allies who were fighting for the rights of citizenship, Sertorius was in the thick of the fighting and lost an eye in combat. But for a man like him, this was far from a weakness. That ghastly wound, the empty socket, became a badge of honor, a permanent and visible symbol of his profound sacrifice for the Republic he loved. He wore the disfigurement not with shame, but with immense pride, a constant, silent reminder to all of his valor, and it earned him the deep, unwavering respect of the common soldiers he led. They saw in him a man who had bled for Rome, just as they had. But Sertorius was so much more than just a ferocious fighter. He was a man of deeply held principle in an age when principles were fast becoming a dangerous liability. The Republic was being violently ripped apart at the seams by two warring political factions: the Optimates, the best men, a cabal of conservative aristocrats hell-bent on preserving the traditional power of the Senate at all costs, and the Populars, the populist party who, at least in theory, claimed to fight for the rights and welfare of the common people. Sertorius, as a loyal protege of the great Marius, was a die-hard popularis. And that ideological commitment put him on a direct, unalterable collision course with the undisputed champion of the Optimates, the terrifying and brilliant Lucius Cornelius Sulla. When Sulla marched his legions on the sacred city of Rome in 83 BCE, it was an act so shocking, so unprecedented, that it shattered the last remaining taboos of the Republic. He had himself declared dictator for life and then unleashed the proscriptions, a meticulously organized and legalized campaign of mass murder directed against all of his political rivals. Lists of condemned men were posted daily in the Roman Forum. Anyone could kill a man on that list and not only receive a handsome reward from the state, but also be legally entitled to a portion of the victim's confiscated property. It was a reign of sheer terror that saw thousands of Roman citizens hunted down and murdered, not for any crime they had committed, but simply for their political allegiances or for the wealth their deaths would transfer to Sulla's coffers. Their families were ruined, their names erased, their legacies destroyed. Sertorius, as a high-profile follower of Marius and a prominent popularis, was at the very top of that death list. He had already been sent to govern the province of Hispania, modern-day Spain, in 83 BCE, a strategic move by his party to get a skilled and loyal commander far away from the escalating chaos in Italy. But with Sulla's ultimate victory, this provincial governorship instantly became a death sentence. Sulla dispatched a powerful army with a single, clear order: remove him. Sertorius was officially declared in hostis, an enemy of the state. He was now a man on the run, a political exile being hunted by the most powerful and utterly ruthless man in the entire Roman world. Forced to flee Spain, he led a small, battered band of his most loyal followers on a desperate odyssey to North Africa, becoming a kind of martial wanderer, a general with no state and an army with no home. He fought as a mercenary for local kings, battled Sulla's pursuing forces, and even forged tactical alliances with Cilician pirates, all while constantly searching for a new place to make a stand. It was during this desperate, uncertain period of exile that he received an invitation he was not expecting. A delegation of elders from the Lusitanians, a fierce and proud Celtic tribe from western Hispania, came to him. They were being crushed under the heel of the new, oppressive Sullan governors and remembered Sertorius's earlier, fairer rule over the province. They made him an offer: come back to Hispania and lead them in a war of liberation against Rome. This was the moment that changed everything. For almost any other Roman of his standing, leading a rebellion of provincials against their own country would have been the ultimate, unthinkable act of treason. But in Sertorius's mind, Rome had already betrayed him. The republic he had fought and bled for, the one his heroes had built, had been hijacked and corrupted by a murderous tyrant. Returning to Spain was no longer just about his own survival. It was about fighting for the Real Rome, the true republic, the one that Sulla had drowned in blood. In the year 80 BCE, he landed back on the Iberian Peninsula, no longer as a hunted fugitive, but as the commander-in-chief of a revolution. The Sertorian War had officially begun. What Quintus Sertorius proceeded to achieve in Hispania over the next 8 years was nothing short of incredible. He did not simply lead some disorganized tribal revolt, a fleeting nuisance to be swatted down by the next arriving legion. Instead, he meticulously constructed a rival Roman state in exile. This was the core of his political and strategic genius. He understood on a fundamental level that to truly beat Rome, he had to become Rome, but a better, more just, and more inclusive version of it. His chosen capital, likely the city of Osca, modern-day Huesca in Spain, became the vibrant heart of this ambitious government in exile. It was there that he implemented his most audacious political move. He established his own Senate, a body of 300 members comprised of the many Roman exiles, senators, and aristocrats who had fled Sulla's blood-soaked reign of terror to join his cause. This was not merely for show. It was a profound and direct ideological challenge to the Sullan regime back in Italy. With this single action, Sertorius was making a powerful, public argument that his government, based on the principles of the old republic, was the true and legitimate one, and that the government occupying the city of Rome was nothing more than an illegal and bloodthirsty tyranny. But his most brilliant and far-sighted move was aimed squarely at the local Spanish people, the Lusitanians and Celtiberians who formed the backbone of his army. Instead of treating them as disposable cannon fodder, as so many Roman commanders would have, he embarked on a revolutionary program to bring them fully into his new, alternative Roman world. He established a prestigious academy in Osca for the sons of the local tribal chieftains. There, these young men received a first-class classical Roman education. They learned to speak and write Latin and Greek. They studied rhetoric and law, and they even wore the traditional white togas of Roman schoolboys. This was completely and utterly unheard of. Roman culture was something to be imposed by force, not offered as a gift. By educating the next generation of Spanish leaders as Romans, he was not only buying the immediate loyalty of their fathers with an astonishing display of goodwill, but he was also creating a permanent, organic, Romanized ruling class for his new state. He was building a future that inextricably tied the destiny of Hispania to his own. Sertorius also intuitively understood the immense power of a good story. He carefully cultivated a legend around himself, a mythic persona that resonated deeply with the highly superstitious Celtic and Iberian tribes who followed him. The most famous and effective element of this legend is the story of the white fawn. As the tale goes, a local hunter presented Sertorius with a pure white, newborn fawn, which he proceeded to tame. The little deer became his constant companion, following him everywhere, even into meetings with his generals. He then publicly declared that this creature was a sacred gift from the goddess Diana, a divine messenger. He claimed the fawn spoke to him in his sleep, revealing the enemy's secret plans and giving him divine advice for the upcoming battles. Whenever he received valuable intelligence from his network of scouts, he would keep it secret, gather his officers, and then pretend that the information had come directly from the fawn. This masterstroke of psychological warfare made his military orders feel less like commands and more like prophecy. To the cynical Roman officers in his camp, it was a clever, if eccentric, trick. But to his Spanish warriors, it was undeniable proof that their leader was a man touched by the gods. They began to call him the New Hannibal, a comparison that must have sent cold shivers of dread down the spines of the senators in Rome. This potent combination of sophisticated state-building, revolutionary cultural fusion, and charismatic, mythic leadership made his movement incredibly resilient and popular. But all of it was backed up by his undisputed genius on the battlefield. For years, he ran circles around the sullen generals who were sent to destroy him. He was an undisputed master of what the Romans called latrocinium, or bandit-like warfare, what we today would call guerrilla tactics. He used the rugged, mountainous Spanish terrain that he knew so well to launch devastating ambushes, to cut enemy supply lines, and to bleed the larger, slower, and more conventional Roman legions dry. He smashed armies much larger than his own, time and time again, with a mixture of daring, cunning, and psychological insight. The general Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, one of Sulla's most respected and experienced commanders, was sent to crush him, but was so completely outmatched and outthought that he was forced to watch helplessly as Sertorius outfoxed him at every single turn. The situation grew so desperate that in 77 BCE, the Senate in Rome was forced to take a drastic, almost illegal step. They turned to a young, wildly ambitious, and dangerously popular commander who, by Roman law, had no legal right to hold such a high command, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great. Pompey, who consciously modeled himself on Alexander the Great, was seen as Rome's wunderkind, their golden boy. Sending him to Spain was a clear sign of pure desperation. They were dispatching their very best to put down the one man who was making the entire republic look weak and incompetent. Pompey arrived in Spain brimming with the arrogance of youth and a string of easy victories, contemptuously dismissing Sertorius as the one-eyed man, and this entire war as a mere police action against a runaway slave. He was about to learn a very harsh and very public lesson. At the Battle of Lauren, Pompey tried to trap Sertorius in a pincer movement, even arrogantly telling the townspeople of Lauren to watch from their walls as he prepared to lay siege. Sertorius, reportedly amused by the young general's hubris, was said to have remarked that he would teach Sulla's pupil a lesson, not in warfare, but in obedience. Through a brilliant series of feints and maneuvers, he turned the tables completely, trapping one of Pompey's legions and then ambushing the relief force sent to save it. Pompey was totally and utterly humiliated, forced to watch as Sertorius burned the very town he had failed to save, losing an estimated 10,000 men in the process. Their intense personal and military rivalry peaked at the bloody Battle of the Sucro River in 75 BCE. In the chaotic heat of the fighting, the two commanders supposedly met and fought in a direct, face-to-face confrontation. Sertorius shattered the wing of the army that Pompey himself was personally leading, wounding the young general and forcing him to flee for his life, leaving behind his jewel-studded and famously expensive horse for Sertorius's men to capture. The only thing that saved Pompey's entire army from being completely annihilated that day was the timely arrival of Metellus's forces on the other flank. The historian Plutarch tells us that as he retreated from the field, a frustrated and exhausted Sertorius quipped, "If this old woman, Metellus, hadn't shown up, I would have given that boy Pompey a good thrashing and sent him packing back to Rome." He had made his point with brutal clarity. He was more than a match for Rome's greatest hero. He was winning. As stunningly successful as he was in Spain, Sertorius was a pragmatist. He knew that beating seasoned generals like Pompey and Metellus on the battlefield was not, in the long run, enough. He could win battles for a decade, but Rome, with its seemingly bottomless pit of manpower, its vast treasury, and its unyielding political will, could simply keep sending more legions, more supplies, more generals. To truly win, to force the sullen regime in Rome to its knees and sue for peace, he had to think bigger. He had to expand the war beyond the borders of Spain and transform his rebellion into a genuine global crisis for the Republic. His grand strategy was as terrifying to the Roman Senate as it was brilliant: to forge a massive, international coalition of Rome's greatest enemies, effectively surrounding the Republic and hitting it from all sides at once. His first strategic move was to gain control of the seas. At this particular time in history, the Mediterranean was not the Mare Nostrum, our sea, that Roman propaganda claimed it to be. It was crawling with highly organized and powerful fleets of Cilician pirates. These were not small-time raiders and fishing boats. They were a formidable, state-like naval force with their own bases, their own command structure, and thousands of ships that crippled Roman shipping lanes, plundered coastal towns with impunity, and had even begun kidnapping Roman nobles for ransom. Rome saw them as a plague to be eradicated, but Sertorius, the ultimate pragmatist, saw them as potential partners. He entered into a formal, diplomatic alliance with them. He gave the pirates precisely what they wanted most: legitimacy and safe, well-defended harbors along the long Spanish coastline. In return, they gave him exactly what he needed most: a powerful, ready-made navy. This alliance immediately threatened to sever the critical supply lines between Italy and Spain, making it almost impossible for Rome to adequately resupply and reinforce Pompey's beleaguered armies. More than that, it gave Sertorius the strategic power to project his force anywhere in the Mediterranean, to strike at Italy itself if he so chose. With the seas now falling under his influence, Sertorius then turned his gaze east, towards Rome's oldest, most powerful, and most persistent foreign enemy, Mithridates VI, the king of Pontus. Mithridates was a force of nature, a brilliant, educated, deeply paranoid, and endlessly ambitious king who had spent decades building his kingdom in modern-day Turkey into a major Hellenistic power. He had already fought 2 massive wars against Rome, and though he had been beaten back both times, he had never truly been broken. He was a master of poisons, famously taking small, sublethal doses of various toxins his entire life to build up immunity, and he nursed a deep, abiding, and intensely personal hatred for the Roman Republic. He was, in short, the perfect ally for Sertorius. Secret negotiations began, most likely arranged by the very pirates who served as a maritime bridge between Sertorius's realm in Spain and Mithridates' kingdom in the Black Sea. The deal they ultimately struck was a formal pact that posed a genuine existential threat to the Roman state. Sertorius, acting as the legitimate head of the Roman government, agreed to officially recognize Mithridates' territorial claims to the wealthy kingdoms of Asia Minor, which Rome also coveted. In return, Mithridates would provide Sertorius with a massive influx of cash and a fleet of warships, 3,000 talents of silver, an astronomical sum, and 40 modern ships. But the real kicker, the part of the deal that was a political masterstroke, was this: Mithridates, one of the most powerful kings on earth, officially recognized Sertorius' government in exile in Spain as the one true, legitimate government of the Roman people. To seal this, Sertorius even sent one of his own Roman officers, a former senator named Marcus Verrius, to serve as an official advisor and general in Mithridates' court. Just pause and think about the implications of that. A Roman senator, acting under the authority of a rival Roman senate in Spain, was now about to lead Pontic troops into battle against the legions of the Roman Republic, all in the name of what he claimed was the real Roman government. The pact was sealed. The Roman Senate's absolute worst nightmare was now a reality. They were facing a coordinated, two-front war on a global scale. In the West, their most brilliant rebel general controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula and commanded the loyalty of the pirates who ruled the waves. In the East, their most bitter and resourceful foreign enemy was rearming for a third war, financed and advised by that very same Roman rebel. This was the moment of maximum danger for the Republic. If Sertorius and Mithridates had managed to synchronize their attacks, the results would have been nothing short of catastrophic. Mithridates could have swarmed over Rome's eastern provinces, cutting off the vital supply of grain and tax revenue that Italy desperately relied on. Simultaneously, Sertorius, his treasury overflowing with Pontic silver and his fleet beefed up with brand new ships, could have finally gone on the offensive, driven Pompey and Metellus out of Spain for good, and perhaps even crossed the Alps into Italy, following the same legendary path that Hannibal had taken a century before. The Roman state, stretched dangerously thin and fighting a world war on two fronts, could have simply collapsed under the strain. This was the precipice. This was how close Quintus Sertorius came to completely and utterly redrawing the map of the ancient world. The Grand Alliance was in place. The strategic pieces were positioned on the board for a final, decisive checkmate against the reeling Roman Republic. So why did it all crumble into dust? Why didn't this apocalyptic two-front war bring Rome to its final ruin? The answer is as old and as tragic as history itself. The greatest and most fatal threat to Quintus Sertorius did not come from Pompey's legions or Metellus' strategies, but from the resentful men who ate at his table and drank his wine. His grand, world-changing vision wasn't undone by a tactical mistake on the battlefield, but by a dirty, squalid conspiracy born of festering jealousy and all-consuming fear. For 8 long, grueling years, the Sertorian War had raged across the breadth of Spain. And while Sertorius himself had won a string of incredible, seemingly impossible victories, the conflict had inevitably bogged down into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. Pompey and Metellus, though often outgeneraled and tactically humiliated, were relentless. Benefiting from a steady, unbroken flow of fresh men and vital supplies from Italy, they slowly, methodically, began to grind Sertorius' forces down. Sieges were lost, key territories were retaken, and the seemingly endless nature of the war began to wear heavily on the nerves of the Roman officers in Sertorius' camp. These were men who had lost their homes, their fortunes, and their futures in Rome, and the dream of a quick, glorious victory was fading. The poisonous seeds of this conspiracy were planted and nurtured by a man named Marcus Pernavento. Perperna was a high-ranking Roman aristocrat of consular rank who had fled to Spain with his own army after leading a failed rebellion in Italy. He arrived with a sense of entitlement, likely expecting to be treated as an equal, or perhaps even to assume leadership of the entire anti-Sulla movement. But when he arrived in Spain, his own soldiers, recognizing that Sertorius was by far the superior general and leader, effectively mutinied and forced him to hand over his command to the one-eyed rebel. It was a profound humiliation that Perperna never, ever got over. He was a man consumed by ambition but lacking the talent to justify it, and he seethed with a deep-seated, aristocratic resentment as he watched Sertorius, a new man from a provincial backwater town, win the slavish adoration of both Romans and Spaniards alike. In his eyes, Sertorius was nothing more than a fugitive, a common outlaw, and he and his snooty circle of aristocratic friends felt it was deeply beneath their station to be taking his orders. The historian Plutarch writes that Perperna possessed an empty ambition for supreme power and began a whispering campaign, spreading poison in the ears of other disillusioned Roman officers, complaining that they, men of noble birth, had become nothing more than the lowly bodyguards of the fugitive Sertorius. Sertorius himself, it must be said, might have inadvertently fueled the fire. The immense pressure of the long war, the betrayals, and the constant threat of assassination started to get to him. The ancient sources, which we must always remember are deeply hostile to him and written by his enemies, claim that in his later years he grew more paranoid, more autocratic, and harsher in his discipline. After a revolt broke out in one of his allied Iberian tribes, he allegedly had the children of the local chiefs, the very same children being educated as future leaders at his school in Osca, either executed or sold into slavery as punishment. This act of shocking cruelty, whether it was driven by a paranoid rage or a cold, calculated strategy to ensure obedience, alienated many of his vital Spanish allies and gave his Roman enemies within his own camp the perfect justification they had been desperately looking for. The Roman general Metellus cleverly fanned these flames of discontent from afar by offering a huge, life-changing reward for Sertorius's head, 100 silver talents and 20,000 acres of land, plus a full and unconditional pardon for any exile who killed him and returned to the fold. For men who had lost everything, the offer was incredibly, fatally tempting. Perperna saw his opening. He gathered a small circle of bitter, jealous Roman officers who felt overshadowed by Sertorius's towering fame and his growing, and to them insulting, trust in his loyal Spanish bodyguard. They convinced themselves that Sertorius was becoming more like a barbarian king than a proper Roman general, and that if he were simply removed, they could easily beat Pompey themselves and then cut a favorable deal with Rome. It was a fatal, arrogant, and breathtakingly foolish miscalculation. The plot was set for the year 72 BCE. The conspirators organized a grand banquet at the military headquarters in Osca, supposedly to celebrate a recent military victory that they had completely fabricated for the occasion. Sertorius, who had grown suspicious of these lavish events and of the men who organized them, initially refused to attend. But they persisted, cajoling and flattering him until he reluctantly agreed. At the dinner, the atmosphere was deliberately and offensively boisterous, a complete and shocking break from the disciplined, orderly gatherings that Sertorius usually presided over. The conspirators spoke loudly, told crude and insulting jokes, and acted in a way they knew would deeply offend their commander's sense of propriety. Sertorius, disgusted by their behavior, leaned back on his dining couch and tried to ignore them, turning his face away. This was the prearranged signal. Perperna dropped a cup of wine to the floor. Instantly, Marcus Antonius, one of the conspirators reclining right next to Sertorius, leaned over and stabbed him with a concealed dagger. Sertorius, though grievously wounded, was an incredibly strong man. He tried to rise and defend himself, but Antonius threw his full body weight on top of him, pinning his arms. The other conspirators then rushed in like a pack of wolves, swarming the helpless general, stabbing him over and over and over again until he lay still in a pool of his own blood. His loyal Spanish bodyguards, waiting outside the dining hall, heard the commotion and were cut down by other conspirators as they tried desperately to rush to his aid. Just like that, in a matter of seconds, it was all over. The one man holding the entire rebellion together, the charismatic leader beloved by the natives, the military genius feared by Rome, the visionary founder of a new nation, lay dead on a dining room floor, murdered not by his sworn enemies, but by his own short-sighted and treacherous lieutenants. We are about to explore the shocking, immediate, and catastrophic fallout of this betrayal and delve deep into the world that could have been if this cowardly plot had failed. The consequences of this single act of treachery are genuinely staggering. But first, if you find yourself fascinated by these hidden stories, the secret histories that truly shape our world, take a brief second to support us here at Chronicles of Old Tales by hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next as we uncover more of history's greatest secrets. The assassination of Quintus Sertorius was supposed to be the glorious beginning of a new chapter for the rebels, a chapter that would be led by the supposedly brilliant Marcus Perperna. Instead, it was the immediate and irrevocable death sentence for the entire movement. The desperate plot to seize control only succeeded in instantly destroying the one and only thing that gave their rebellion any power, any legitimacy, and any hope of success: Sertorius himself. The fallout was immediate, total, and absolutely catastrophic. The moment the news of Sertorius's murder spread beyond the walls of the headquarters, his magnificent creation fell apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. The Spanish tribes had been fiercely and personally loyal to Sertorius himself, to the charismatic, one-eyed general who wore his scars with pride and who, they believed, spoke to the gods through a sacred white fawn. They felt no such loyalty, only contempt, for the treacherous and incompetent aristocrat Perperna. In the days that followed, many of his Iberian and Celtic allies simply packed up their belongings, abandoned the cause, and went home. Their loyalty had been to a man, not to an abstract cause represented by men they despised. The rebel army, which had been a disciplined and deadly fighting machine under Sertorius, fractured and collapsed almost overnight into a demoralized and bickering rabble. Perperna, the great conspirator, finally had the supreme command he had coveted for so long, and he immediately proceeded to prove to the entire world how completely and utterly unworthy of it he was. He led what was left of the shattered and demoralized army into battle against Pompey, hoping desperately for a quick, decisive victory that would legitimize his new authority. Instead, Pompey, the general who could never decisively beat Sertorius in years of trying, absolutely crushed Perperna's army in their very first engagement. Perperna himself was captured alive. In a final, cowardly, and despicable act, he tried to save his own skin by offering Pompey something incredibly explosive, all of Sertorius's private correspondence. He claimed these letters contained proof that some of the most powerful and respected senators back in Rome had been secretly communicating with Sertorius, plotting with him. Handing them over would have undoubtedly kicked off a new round of bloody purges, political trials, and perhaps even a fresh civil war in the capital. It was here that Pompey showed the flashes of political genius that would later make him so powerful. Instead of greedily reading the letters and using them as a weapon to ruin his political rivals, he gathered up all the captured documents, every last letter and dispatch, and in a grand public gesture, burned them, unread, in front of his entire assembled army. With this single, brilliant piece of political theater, he instantly calmed the fears of Rome's nervous elite, positioning himself not as another divisive Sulla, but as a unifier and a healer of the state. It gained a massive political clout back home. Then, having secured his political victory, he had Perperna and all the other assassins unceremoniously executed. The Sertorian War was over. With the conspiracy's swift and total failure, we are left standing on the edge of one of history's greatest and most tantalizing what-ifs. What if the assassination had failed? What if Sertorius had lived to see his grand alliance with Mithridates launch its coordinated attack? The possibilities are genuinely mind-boggling. A synchronized, two-front war could very well have broken the Republic's back. With a flood of Pontic money and ships, and with Mithridates' armies tying up Roman legions and resources in the east, Sertorius could have finally gained the upper hand needed to boot Pompey and Metellus from Spain for good. What would his next move have been? Perhaps crossing the Pyrenees and the Alps into Italy itself. An invasion of the homeland led by a general of his caliber, a beloved former popularis, possibly supported by still disaffected and unhappy groups within Italy itself, could have succeeded where so many others had failed. And what would a Rome ruled or reformed by Sertorius have looked like? He was not just another warlord hungry for absolute power. He was a popularis whose entire political project in Spain was built on a more inclusive and integrated model than Rome had ever attempted. He created a functional multi-ethnic state where Roman exiles and Spanish nobles governed side by side as equals. He educated local children as future citizens, not as conquered subjects to be exploited. Could he have reformed the dying, sclerotic republic? Could his vision have led to a Roman Empire that was less of a brutal oligarchy, more of an integrated commonwealth, and maybe, just maybe, less dependent on the endless, bloody civil wars that defined the next generation? His survival would have completely changed the trajectories of the men who shaped the next 50 years of Roman, and therefore world, history. Without his triumphant victory in Spain, Pompey the Great would not have returned to Rome with the overwhelming power and prestige that allowed him to form the first triumvirate with Crassus and Caesar. And without that powerful triumvirate completely dominating Roman politics and setting the stage, the career of a young, ambitious, and at that point relatively minor politician named Julius Caesar might have gone in a totally different, less spectacular direction. The entire chain of events, the rise of the triumvirate, Caesar's conquest of Gaul, the Rubicon, the final civil war, and the ultimate fall of the Republic and rise of the Roman Empire, could have been decisively broken. Our world, a world built on the foundations of Roman law, language, and culture as they were actually established by those men, might be utterly unrecognizable. The story of Quintus Sertorius is so much more than just a forgotten chapter in a long-dead Roman civil war. It is a powerful, profound, and deeply unsettling lesson in just how fragile history truly is. It shows us, with chilling clarity, that the world we live in was never guaranteed. It was not preordained. It was forged in chaotic, violent moments, shaped by the will of remarkable individuals. And it often turned on the smallest and most fragile of things, a lingering spark of jealousy, a whispered conspiracy in a dark corner, a dagger in the dark at a dinner party. Sertorius was a brilliant and principled outcast, a man who built a nation from nothing but his own force of will and the incredible loyalty he inspired in others. He created and fought for a vision of a different kind of Rome, one that was perhaps more just, more equitable, and more inclusive than the one that had brutally cast him out. He came closer than any other single individual to breaking the Roman Republic, and he was brought down from the very brink of success not by the mighty armies arrayed against him, but by the petty, pathetic ambitions of the men standing right beside him. His story stands as a chilling and eternal reminder that history is not some grand, impersonal force, no abstract wave moving through time. It is a human story, messy and unpredictable, full of chance, coincidence, genius, and betrayal. The world that we have inherited was built directly on the ruins of the one that Quintus Sertorius almost created. And we are left to wonder about the ghost of that other world, a world of tantalizing possibilities, a world that was lost forever in a single, treacherous, and tragic moment. What do you think? Was Sertorius a forgotten hero, a visionary trying to build a better Rome? Or was he a dangerous rebel who would have simply plunged the world into even more chaos? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most critical and forgotten stories, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with anyone who loves to question the official story. Here at Chronicles of Old Tales, we believe the past is never truly past. Check out our playlist for more investigations into ancient mysteries, forgotten wars, and grand conspiracies. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another journey with us into the world that almost was. Thanks for watching.